Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Stewart Mednick, the vice commander of the Minnesota Department of the Jewish War Veterans. We talk about what the JWV is and how it came to existence, Stewart's unconventional journey to enlisting in the Navy, and how he's trying to grow the JWV presence here in Minnesota on this week's Who the Folk podcast. But before we get started, be sure to check out some of the other podcasts that Jewfolk produces, like The Jews Are Tired, where Lev Gringos is taking a deep dive into Jewish news, Kumba Hineni, Jewfolk's podcast on intersectionality with your host, Enzi Tanner. And if you're looking for a weekly dose of Jewish pop culture, check out The Bagel Report, produced by Jewfolk in partnership with Jay, the Jewish News of Northern California. Go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast to learn more. Stewart Mednick, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Lonnie.
Stewart, you are part of the Jewish War Veterans Department of Minnesota. You are the department vice commander.
That is correct.
So tell me and listeners a little bit, for starters, about what the Jewish War Veterans Department of Minnesota is and what the role of the organization is within the community.
Great question. The Jewish War Veterans of America, first of all, is a national organization, and we are the oldest chartered, congressionally chartered veteran organization in the country.
Really?
We existed since 1896. And the reason why we came about was because post-Civil War, there was a lot of social, I don't know if I'd call it unrest or disagreement, but controversy, we'll say, about the Jews and their involvement in the Civil War.
Really? I had no idea.
And so I can't tell you the exact history of what the actual organization name was back at the day, but the Jews got together and said, hey, we need to unite and dispel the myths that, yes, we actually were involved and helped support this country. And so that's how we came about. Actually, a couple years later, the Veterans of Foreign War was originated.
Okay.
And but the Jewish War Veterans are an organization that support the Jewish community, veterans, and it's very unique because it's the only organization that has ties to both military and the society because of Jews and veterans. So what we stand for is to support, protect the Jewish name, the Jewish veterans' families, provide assistance whenever possible. And actually, I brought a copy of the National Constitution Preamble that I'd be happy to read because that will kind of sum up pretty well what the reason is that the Jewish War Veterans exist.
Please, that'd be great.
So, the National Constitution Preamble. We, citizens of the United States of America of the Jewish faith, who served in the wars of the United States of America, in order that we may be of greater service to our country and to one another, associate ourselves together for the following purposes: to maintain true allegiance to the United States of America, to foster and perpetuate true Americanism, to combat whatever tends to impair the efficiency and permanency of our free institutions, to uphold the fair name of the Jew and fight his or her battles wherever unjustly assailed, to encourage the doctrine of universal liberty, equal rights, and full justice for all men and women, to combat the powers of bigotry and darkness wherever originating and whatever their target, to preserve the spirit of comradeship by mutual helpfulness to comrades and their families, to cooperate with and support existing educational institutions and establish new educational institutions, and to foster the education of ex-servicemen and ex-servicewomen and our members in the ideals and principles of Americanism, to instill love of country and flag, and to promote sound minds and bodies in our members and our youth, to preserve the memories and records of patriotic service performed by the men and women of our faith, to honor their memory and shield from neglect the graves of our historic and heroic dead.
It's very powerful.
Isn't it? Covers a lot of grounds, too.
A lot of ground.
Now, the one thing that I do want to point out above all is we are the only veteran organization in the country from the very existence, and perhaps at all, that stands for combating bigotry. And if you look at the history of the United States, especially through World War II, you will see that there were some organizations that weren't so friendly to the Jewish population in the United States. Just leave it at that.
Yeah.
But for the most part, what really strikes a nerve with me is to foster and perpetuate true Americanism. I love that term because for me, that's all-encompassing, which means even if a person is not Jewish, but still believes in exactly everything that I just read, then if they believe that what we stand for and the activities we participate in are good and true, they might want to also participate in activities that the Jewish war veterans have. We even have what's called a patron, which is a type of a membership where if you're not a Jewish war veteran but still are interested in participating and joining our organization, that's the route that people can do.
Oh, it's interesting. I didn't realize that you could join if you weren't.
Exactly. And I think that's really important too, because this is really kind of a good segue to why that's important.
Yes.
So the majority of veteran members are World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War era.
Right.
Which means some are as old as over 100 years old. Some are as young as in their 70s. Now, I happen to be a Gulf War era veteran.
Okay.
So I was discharged in 1992. I'm one of the younger members.
Okay.
But veterans, unfortunately, are dying faster than our new members are joining. And that is actually an issue across the board for all the veteran service organizations, or VSOs, as we refer to them. Mm-hmm. So to give you an idea of how difficult it is for the JWV to gain membership, in national numbers first,
Okay.
there are approximately 16.5 million veterans in the U.S. according to a 2022 census, and that is about 6.4% of the adult population in the U.S. Now, if you think about that number, probably doesn't mean anything to you, but if we go back to World War II, when we actually had 12.5 million service members active.
Right.
So that was 12 million active, and now today we have 16.5 million veterans, which spans many generations, and today there's only about 1.3 million active military members across all branches of the service.
Yeah.
So it's significantly smaller. Just because of that, the base that all the veteran service organizations could feed from is severely diminished.
Right.
So that's one of the issues straight up. In Minnesota, we have 327,000 veterans. Okay, so that's the base that the JWV Minnesota department can pull from. Of that, let's look at the other demographic of Jews.
Right.
So in Minnesota, according to a 2019 survey, there are 34,500 Jewish households, which incorporate 64,800 Jews. And apparently that's growing because from the previous numbers, which I guess were roughly about 10 years prior, that was an increase of 34%.
15 years prior, but also there was some change in the methodology, and the counting geography.
Sure. So, and this is just to give a general idea of round
a
numbers.
little bit of context for the
Right,
numbers.
exactly.
Sure.
So now we have one pool of 327,000 that's veterans.
Okay.
Another pool that's 64,800 Jews. Now, if we put them together, what we have is a membership in the state of Minnesota of 108 Jewish war veterans.
Wow.
Now, the Jewish war veterans nationally has 15,000 members.
Okay.
Now, to put that into context, the Veterans of Foreign War in the state of Minnesota alone is approximately 42,000
Okay.
just in Minnesota.
Right.
The American Legion in Minnesota is approximately 64,000.
Okay.
And we're talking 15,000 nationally for
Right.
the JWV.
You know, we're talking about contextualizing the numbers, right? So you mentioned the era most of the Jewish war veterans come out of, and a lot of that has to do, I would imagine, please by all means correct me if I'm wrong, with the fact that there is no longer a draft.
Correct.
That, you know, there was through Vietnam, and then that's when obviously people had to serve or try to get out of service. But for the
Right.
you know, for the most part, like that's the reason why, you know, the numbers are what they are, and the demographic skews older.
Yeah, exactly. I believe in 1971 was the peak of our service member occupation in Vietnam, and I believe
Okay.
it was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 500,000. Through all of Vietnam, there were a total of about 30,000 Jews that served in the military.
Wow. Okay.
So again, if there were, a few million people, men and women that served during Vietnam from its beginning, roughly 1963, to its end, roughly 1975, 30,000 Jews out of the millions that served, that's really, again, not a very good population.
No.
So, Jewish war veterans, you have to be a veteran. You have to be a veteran during a time of war, and you have to be Jewish.
And I was going to ask you what what qualifies.
Right. And so that's a very, very thin slice of the pie.
Yeah, that's very true.
And that's why, in my opinion, patron is very important.
Sure.
Because that's how we can grow our membership and keep the interest of what it is that we stand for and the activities we perform. Because right now there's very few people performing activities within the organization nationwide, and membership growth is an issue.
Right.
So how do you grow membership, especially if the pool to choose from has been shrinking significantly over many decades?
So you are a member of the Jewish war veterans because of your service in the Navy. When did you join, and what was it that led you to join?
Are you talking about joining the Navy or joining the JWV?
Joining the Navy.
Okay. The reason why I joined the Navy was because when I was in high school, first of all, go back a little bit, my father had passed away, and so that kind of put my college plans on hold. So I was going to college at a junior college so I could stay at home, help keep the house running, worked a full-time job while I was going to school. And that's where I met my future wife, and we eventually got married, had a kid, and I was going to college studying music, and I went to the Chicago Conservatory of Music, where I found that my passion was truly working in audio engineering. And so I really enjoyed spending time with the technology element of music
sure.
more than performance. So I transferred to Ball State University, which was one of the very few colleges at the time that had a 4-year degree in audio engineering. To my chagrin, what I found out was, unlike at the Chicago Conservatory, the audio engineering program was a legit engineering program. So it was necessary for me to be able to pursue that degree. I had to go through the prerequisite chain of calculus, audio, electronics, digital electronics, and that would have added about 3 years.
Oh.
So my wife and I had a serious heart-to-heart. It's like, okay, what are we going to do? Do I want to do this? How are we going to survive,
Right.
et cetera? And with her history of military family members, she suggested, well, maybe you should go in the military. You could get a good education, get paid while you learn. I'm like, I don't know. Anyway, I ended up taking an entrance exam into the Navy, pretty much aced it, and they said, you can do whatever you want. What do you want to do? And I said, give me your highest tech program you've got. And they said, perfect. We're going to put you on submarines.
I hope you're not claustrophobic.
No.
Oh, good.
Otherwise, I would not have been able to serve.
No kidding.
So that's basically how I wound up in the Navy. So I ended up serving on ballistic missile submarines, and I worked with inertial navigation systems, ballistic missile guidance systems, satellite navigation systems, and bathymetric operations. Sounds impressive, huh?
It does. There's several of those words I have no idea what they mean, but I'll take your word for it that they're actual words, that you didn't just make them up on the spot here.
Right. It was really all about the guidance of missiles so they can know where they are and where they're going. The navigation of the submarine so we know where we are under the water.
Sure.
And the satellite navigation portion is, believe it or not, satellites are the most accurate forms of navigation. These days we have GPS, so I don't think anybody's going to dispute that.
Right.
But back then, GPS did not exist.
Right.
So it was the polar orbit navigation satellites that went around the world. And whenever we were in, let's just say, line of sight of a satellite, the submarine would come up to what's called periscope depth. So that little appendage sticks out of the water, and that's all. And then we would have this satellite antenna that would receive the satellite transmission. We would use that to update our position for the submarine, and that's what we did.
Everything I know about submarines I learned from The Hunt for Red October. So it's about where my knowledge stops. But periscope depth, I understand. So at what point did you join JWV?
Well, I was honorably discharged in 1992, which was really a result of the Cold War ending in 91. Berlin Wall fell. Dick Cheney at the time was Secretary of Defense, and me being a ballistic missile submarine sailor, which was basically created strictly because of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Since they disbanded, we really didn't have a target at the time, so defense budget cut. And at that point, they said, well, do you want to get out? We'll buy out your contract. Okay. Because it was really questionable, what were they going to do with all of us ballistic missile submarine sailors? So I just started my civilian career, and my last duty station actually was here in Minneapolis. So I just settled down here because it had a good Jewish community, great place to raise a family. And in, I guess it was about 2008 timeframe, Peter Nikitas, who was at the time the post 354 commander, which is the largest post we have in the Twin Cities. I met him through my job as a veteran service officer at Hennepin County. And he said, hey, have you ever thought about joining? And I ended up becoming a life member at that point. So, and my activities and involvement with JWV had steadily increased since. So I've been and currently am the post commander for post 354 and also the vice commander for the Department of Minnesota, which means I'm basically second in charge of the state.
Okay. And how many posts are there in Minnesota?
We have 3, post 354, 162, and 331.
And geographically, what do those cover?
Basically all the Twin City area.
Okay.
So And it's kind of funny you say that because one of the initiatives that we are undergoing is to be able to create more posts in outstate Minnesota because there are plenty of Jews in the Duluth area,
Absolutely.
Superior around there, and a lot of history there, in fact. And there's plenty of Jews down in the Rochester area. And we should probably initiate having posts created in those areas. So again, based on the numbers we talked about earlier, even
Right.
though there are plenty of Jews, how many Jewish war veterans are there?
Right. That's right. So, as you've sort of gotten more and more involved steadily in JWV, at least here locally in Minnesota, have you been looking to sort of grow the? I mean, it sounds like you're trying to grow the organization, but in terms of like outreach and trying to get people to understand, how has that gone so far?
Over the last year and a half is really when we started the initiative.
Okay.
And the reason why we did is because we were one of the recipients of a grant from the Minnesota Department of Veteran Affairs. Now, I'm sure many people have seen the variety of license plates that we have in the state of Minnesota.
Absolutely.
One of which is the eagle with the flag in the back, and it says on the top of the plate, support our troops. Well, or SOT. The money that the state gains from that, which is roughly about $300,000, is granted to the veteran service organizations every year. And we applied, we meaning JWV, applied for a grant, and we were granted a very nice amount of money from the Minnesota Department of Veteran Affairs. And that money is being used to upgrade the technology in our office, create some social media, update our website, Facebook presence, and also to initiate outreach in, like I said, the other parts of the state where we don't have any posts. So with all this, we have been brainstorming what are the activities we can perform, where are the venues that we can reach out to, like the Federation or this one small media-based organization, maybe you heard of them, the TC Jew Folk.
Vaguely familiar.
Yeah, so...
Sounds a little familiar.
Yeah. But, that's one reason why I'm here is so that people could say, Jewish war veterans, never heard of them. Now you have.
Yes. So one of the things that you mentioned you had recently, you as in JWV, recently was there was a art exhibit at the Cap Center, the Minnesota JCC in St. Paul, titled "Defending Democracy." What was that exhibit about, and how did it come together?
Great question. That was a really good event that we had. And again, we brainstormed when we have our monthly meetings and our executive committee. What can we do as a social event that would be pretty universal where we can attract people and also be able to, again, get our name out there, so to speak? Art seems to be the universal equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not. It doesn't matter if you're a veteran or not. It doesn't matter what your age is. Art is appreciated, and there are plenty of artists out there. So last year, about July, we pulled together this art exhibit, and it really wasn't nearly enough time to be able to put it together as robustly as we wanted to.
Right.
However, in my opinion, it was still a great success. The Jewish Community Center in St. Paul, the CAP Center, was extremely generous in allowing us to display our art in their facility. We ended up having roughly about 8 artists that showed up and provided their art. When I say showed up, meaning had reached out to us and said, I have art that I'd like to display.
That's great.
Some art was existing in their repertoire, some was created. And to your point, the theme was defending democracy. Defending democracy came about because of the National Constitution preamble that I had read to you,
Right.
which basically says exactly that. And we thought that it was a very powerful theme for an art exhibition. And we had some great art, a lot of it fairly controversial. There was one veteran who is a photographer who did some really great art, and he said he really loved our theme and the ability for him to display his photography because many art exhibitions wouldn't allow him to show his art because of the controversy of the content.
What was the content?
It's all military based because he was a soldier. He served in Afghanistan.
Oh, okay.
And his photography was basically staged photography where he had military members in full combat gear with weapons, like, for example, on patrol. And then alongside these military members or army was a woman in civilian clothes talking on her cell phone. So the dichotomy was here we are at war while society is back home talking on their phones. There was another one that was very powerful of a medic doing field first aid to an injured soldier and a woman sitting next to them putting on her makeup. So that type of a content.
Got it.
And that was very controversial. So there were a lot of art exhibitions or art halls or galleries
Sure.
that just didn't want to display his art. So he was very, very grateful to be allowed to have the art. And I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was very much well within the guidelines of defending democracy.
Oh, sure. And good art it doesn't need to be controversial necessarily, but it at least starts conversation.
Agreed.
At least I think, but, again, that's the eye of the beholder.
So it was a very successful art exhibition that we held at the beginning of December last year, and the JCC was very generous to allow the art to stay up through the end of the year, and it was wonderful. So we've already started planning for another art exhibition this year, again in December timeframe. Yep. And so hopefully we will be able to expand the venues of being able to announce the art exhibition and solicit for artists.
Well, that's great. And this time, planning a little further in advance maybe can help you, draw more voices into the exhibition.
I agree.
So JWV being a national organization, how much did the state departments sort of, or even more granular than that, individual posts within the State Department bounce ideas off each other in different places? Like, do you bounce ideas off of people in like Tampa or North Carolina, like some just ways to talk about programming and drawing more interest and getting the word out generally about the Minnesota chapter?
From the JWV Minnesota Department perspective, we have very limited interaction for that specific topic.
Okay.
We do have a good relationship with the Department of Wisconsin, of course, both being upper Midwest.
Sure.
And we also do have very good communication with National, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And other than that, it's, from our perspective, we don't really have a whole lot of social interaction with all the other departments across the state. Maybe that is a good venue for us to pursue so that we can bounce ideas against each other. But we do have an annual convention where everyone meets. And then there's also a National Executive Committee where they talk about the rules, regulations, Constitution, bylaws. So there is also quite a bit of interaction more on the upper echelon.
Okay.
In terms of membership, no, I don't really know that we have that much.
Curious because it feels like that could be something helpful in terms of trying to develop some programming that, maybe other departments are, ahead of Minnesota in that regard. They've been doing it longer and may have some ideas of ways to engage.
Well, we do have a national newspaper called the Jewish Veteran, and posts and departments do send in stories about activities that they are performing or performed, membership, special interest articles, things of that sort. And I am intending to submit such articles as well.
Good.
One particular event that recently just took place that I wanted to advertise, if you will, or submit, which is the involvement that we had with the USAA and what is being called the Super Bowl surprise. So the USAA is a strong advocate of the military, and every year they randomly select a veteran from each of the 8 different veteran service organizations to attend the Super Bowl free of charge. Serendipitously this year, post 354 in our department in Minnesota was able to have a veteran selected to be able to attend the Super Bowl. And the entire process was pretty top secret, actually. The national executive director of the JWV contacted me and said, Stu, I need you to do this. Well, the reason why was because our department commander and everyone else was at the National Executive Committee meeting in D.C. at the time. So I was the highest ranking officer in the state when that happened. So there was actually only 3 people in the entire Jewish war veteran community nationwide that knew of this event because it had to be a complete surprise. That was the National Executive Director, Peter Nikitas, who is the National Judge Advocate and also a Post 354 member.
Oh.
And myself.
Okay.
So Peter reached out to me, and the National Director did, and said, okay, the veteran, who's Bruce Legan, we're going to do a surprise for him. And Stu, we need you to be boots on the ground to be able to organize this. So we worked it out for him to come to the JCC to be interviewed by the USAA to talk about his military service. And that was the ruse. Okay. What he didn't know was that Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings was going to present him 2 tickets to the Super Bowl free of charge. So I set it up with the USAA, with their camera crew, with their media people. They all came into town, set everything up, got Bruce there, started interviewing him. And lo and behold, here comes Justin Jefferson walking in the room, introduced and gave him the tickets, and it was a great surprise.
The video is fantastic, and we will put a link to that in the show notes because it's an incredibly sweet and touching moment for JJ to when he comes in the room. It's really cool. And the shock was palpable.
Oh, yeah. Well, Bruce had said, and also in just his follow-up thanks, that this was definitely the event of a lifetime. And why wouldn't it be?
Sure.
I mean, first of all, just the average person can't even afford to go these days. But to be able to have all expense paid, flight, hotel, access to the Super Bowl, mingle with other veterans, mingle with NFL stars, and just enjoy the entire event over the weekend. who wouldn't say that would be an event of a lifetime?
Right. And it's great for JWV to get that sort of acknowledgement at that stage.
Correct.
That doesn't hurt.
Even though other veteran service organizations also had the exact type of event, our presentation was the only one that the USAA actually filmed.
Oh, really?
Correct.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So, again, I think it was just absolutely wonderful. It all went extremely well. And again, Bruce was just beside himself. And I was very happy to be part of it, to see the joy in his face. And honestly, sidebar, Justin Jefferson is quite the stand-up individual.
Yep.
He was very friendly. He was very happy to be there. He doesn't have any military involvement in his family, so to be able to participate with a veteran organization to do this was quite the honor for him. And you will also see at the end of that video, which is only about, I believe, a 2-minute, 20-second video.
Roughly, yeah, a couple minutes, not much longer.
The USAA film crew was very gracious when I asked the favor if I could present a challenge coin to Justin, and they filmed it, and you'll see him, me presenting it to him holding it up, and I verbally made him an honorary member of the Minnesota Department of Jewish War Veterans, and he was extremely grateful for that.
You know, I've heard by all accounts, besides his outstanding and at times just ridiculous play on the field, he is truly a stand-up individual.
He is.
Once you get him even off the field out of uniform, he's just it's so nice and pleasant and gracious to almost everyone. I mean, I haven't heard a bad word about him and how he's interacted with folks.
I've interacted with, let's just say, celebrities in the past, and many of them have the opinion of, all right, contractually, I'm supposed to be here 60 minutes, and they just did their time, and as soon as the clock hit 60, all right, I'm out.
Yep.
He wasn't like that at all. He genuinely wanted to be there and participate. He genuinely was very open and willing to do this, and he genuinely really appreciated the veterans and being able to present the tickets to Bruce, and he was just wonderful, very open, willing to just be there willingly, learn a little bit, participate, and create a little bit of joy in someone's life.
Well, he's a mensch, and again, I encourage everyone to go watch the video because it's very cool. It is a very cool moment for Bruce and for Justin and for you to have been a part of.
Yeah, and that video did post in Justin Jefferson's Twitter.
Oh.
And I think to date, last time I checked a few days ago, I believe it had roughly about 95,000 views.
That's pretty good. That's not bad. That is not bad at all. So you mentioned, jumping around a little bit, you mentioned when you were honorably discharged from the Navy, went on to civilian life. What is civilian life for you? What was your next stage?
Well, that was a good question because when I was discharged, it was kind of unexpected.
Sure.
At the time, I was, let's just say, thinking about a life as a career, 20 years, retire. Mm-hmm. And I was in for roughly about 9 years when this offer to leave service came around. The future was pretty unknown at that time in the Navy. And after a very deep heart-to-heart with my wife and my commanding officers trying to think, okay, what do I want to do? I decided to separate. And my first job out of the service was actually working at the Coke refinery down in Rosemont.
Oh, okay.
Petroleum refinery.
Yeah.
And to me, that was actually kind of a civilian form of being on a submarine because everything that I had to learn on the submarine applied to the refinery. a quick sidebar. On a submarine, everyone needs to be submarine warfare qualified. To be able to do that, everyone needs to learn all the submarine systems. The electrical distribution and creation, nuclear propulsion, weapon systems, hydraulic systems, tanks and compartments, how to create water, what to do in terms of an emergency, battle stations, damage control, everything.
Yeah.
Very, very intense. And so my submarine warfare pin, or dolphins, as we refer to it, is a very coveted award that I've earned. So with that said, when I went into the refinery, hydraulics, electrical distribution, learning all about the distillation process of crude oil, it was kind of the same thing.
Interesting.
And so it was a very easy transition for me to be able to do that. So I did that for just about 5 years or so. Shortly around that time is when I decided I wanted to go back to college, because while I was working there, so again, for my story, I never finished college when I enlisted in service. And it wasn't until I was working at the refinery I went back to night school and finished my undergrad degree.
Okay.
So shortly thereafter, I left coke refining and went to St. Thomas to pursue my MBA. And I pursued it in finance and strategy. I was able to land an internship at U.S. Bank, which turned into a full-time job as a business banker. And so then I started my career in finance. There was some financial issues in our country, if you recall, like around the mid-2000s, because you got to remember my time frame here is about the 1990s.
Right.
And I eventually worked my way into mortgage, worked in financial services, some brokerage houses, and somewhere around 2006, 2008, we had a huge financial issue because of all that. And I said, all right, I want to get out of finance. I don't want to be part of the problem anymore.
Sure.
So I ended up actually getting a job as a veteran service officer for Hennepin County. Honestly, I didn't even know what it was. And what I found out was pretty much every veteran, anybody that served in the military, typically has some form of disability, and they could file a claim to be able to get benefits for it.
Right.
Or many veterans just needed financial assistance or other type of medical assistance. And through the federal VA system or the Minnesota Department of Veteran Affairs, there are all kinds of programs available. And that's what I did. I helped veterans with their claims. Also, I was honored to be part of the development of a veterans court. And at that time, I think it was maybe the 15th veterans court in the country. I think now there are hundreds. That was great because the judge was a veteran, the prosecuting attorneys and defense attorneys were all veterans or engaged in the JAG system in reserves. I represented there, the VA were representatives there, and veterans that were incarcerated or arrested were part of this court. And essentially what our purpose was is to say the reason why they're here is because of some type of an issue that manifested itself from their service. Let's figure out what it is. Let's help them, because for any veteran out there who's listening, you know that you can relate to other veterans. And many times civilians just, quote unquote, don't get me.
Right.
So that was really a great thing to participate in. Eventually, I left there and went on to consult for Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Services as a Department of Defense consultant and worked in their healthcare systems. And healthcare and finance are very similar in terms of someone needs something. So you apply for it, you're underwritten, you're approved or not approved,
Right.
and then you distribute funds or services. So I've been a consultant ever since, working in both healthcare and finance.
How did your service in the Navy and everything you've done since, both within the veteran sphere and outside of it. How did that connect to your Judaism?
It really didn't.
Totally fair. That's fine.
And it's pretty funny because, well, first of all, again, in our prior conversation, not a whole lot of Jews
Right.
ever active duty in the military.
True.
There are, but very few.
Yeah.
And the chaplains, as they're called in service, of all faiths, there were actually Jewish chaplains that I did associate with. At one time, there was one chaplain that basically said, yeah, military isn't really much for a Jewish lifestyle, especially if you want to be conservative or orthodox because dietary needs, way of life, beards, hair length, things like that. The military wasn't that flexible for a lot of those lifestyles. However, on a submarine, if our deployment was going to be through Passover, for example, I was provided the option if I wanted to have a Passover package so that I could have Passover food. That was all fine and great. However, the reality is, once we're underway, it seems like it's always a burden for one individual to have to be provided for something special, vice still being the mainstream. So, again, it's very difficult. I did have a military issue prayer book.
Okay.
So I was able to observe and pray as I wanted while I was deployed. And many times I brought my own food, spirituality also, if you will.
Sure.
So I was able to observe my Judaism while I was in military. And I think these days it's probably a lot easier because there's a lot more tolerance for diversity in the service. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, for sure.
But did I ever really run across any anti-Semitism in service? I was fortunate that I really didn't. People accepted me for who I was. And again, because you're on a submarine and you're in very close contact with 150 other guys under the water, for me, for almost, 86 days was my longest deployment under the water.
Wow.
So you basically have to put up with each other. And there was quite a diversity of people, origin, color, religious background, social, economic, stature, and it didn't matter. We all got along, we did our job.
I mean, that's sort of like you have to, right? It's dangerous situations. You have jobs to do. You're all counting on each other.
Exactly. And one thing that I learned, which was a big life lesson, was you don't have to like people to work alongside them. You just have to do what you need to do. And here in the civilian world, you could go home to the family, to your friends, leave them. On a submarine, not so much.
Nope.
You still see them. Now, you don't have to socialize with them outside of when you're standing watch, but you still have to get along.
Yep.
And as long as you get the job done, if there's battle stations or if there's damage control, flooding, or nuclear leak, radiation
Right.
leak, you have to react and do your job, period.
Yep.
And that's what we're trained to do.
Fascinating life to live. That is for sure.
Definitely unique.
Yeah, I think that's probably an understatement. Stewart, last couple of questions I have for you. First, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
I would have to say Passover,
Okay. How come?
the food.
Yeah.
So going all the way back to my childhood memories, it's always this battle about the matzo ball. Are the knedlach going to be hard or soft?
Yep.
And the chicken soup, is it going to be savory? My childhood memories of my grandparents and all the aunts and uncles were all came from Eastern Europe,
Okay.
somewhere around the turn of the century. So they spoke Yiddish or Russian, Polish in the household. But anyway, Passover is when we all got together. And my dad, God rest his soul, loved golf balls when it came to matzo balls. That was just it, period.
Wanted heavy.
Very hard.
Okay.
So I learned how to make a really good matzo ball in his book. And that's kind of what it was. He hated sponges.
Love the reference there. And what is your favorite Jewish food?
Does it have to be one?
No. It rarely is with people. They try to squeeze in as many as they can.
Well, again, I'm going to go back to my childhood memories because my grandma would make kishka.
Oh.
And this is back when you could actually get the true intestines, and she would buy pounds and pounds of suet. I would help her grate the carrots and the onions and hand stuff all the kishka and then put it in this huge pot on the stove and cook it. So I absolutely love that. That was one of my all-time favorite foods as a result. She also made great kreplach, and you don't find that very much these days.
Love krepla.
Yeah.
Love.
She had sweet and sour stuffed cabbage, which was to die for. So most of my favorite foods is a result of my childhood memories, and those are my favorite foods.
Fantastic. Well, Stewart Mednick, thank you so much for joining me this week, and I really appreciate learning all about the Jewish War Veterans Department here in Minnesota. We thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us.
Well, I appreciate that. And if anybody wants to learn more or reach out to contact me, you could go to our website, www.mnjwv.org. And I will give you a heads up. Please be a little forgiving because, like I said, we're trying to develop it a little further with our grants. We are not very social media savvy yet, but we're getting there. So if anybody is willing to want to help, volunteer their time, hey, we would love to have people get more involved with our organization.
Well, excellent. We will have links to the website and more goodies in the show notes so people can go check it out. Thanks, Stewart.
Thank you, Lonnie. Appreciate your time.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.